What is the meaning of these letters?
My letters! Where did you get them? Your handwriting betrays you.
It is true. Forgive me.
I wrote my husband 312 letters over the course of our marriage, and he never replied to a single one. The first letter was sent 3 days after our wedding, when he left for London without explanation. I was 24 years old, newly married, abandoned in a vast estate I did not know, surrounded by servants who regarded me with barely concealed suspicion. My dearest Henry, I had written, I hope your journey was comfortable. I find myself somewhat lost in this great house, but I am determined to learn its ways and make it a home for us both. Please write when you are able. I miss you already. He never replied. I told myself he was busy. I told myself letters went astray. I told myself that silence did not necessarily mean indifference. Over the following 23 years, I continued to write. I wrote about the estate, the household, the tenants who needed his attention. I wrote about political developments, family news, the changing seasons. I wrote when I was lonely, which was often. I wrote when I was ill, hoping for comfort. I wrote when significant events occurred, deaths, births, crises, things a husband should know. 312 letters, carefully composed, faithfully sent. Not one reply. I learned to live with the silence, as I learned to live with everything else about my marriage. My husband was a cold man, distant, occupied with matters in London that apparently precluded communication with his wife. When he visited the estate, perhaps twice a year, rarely for more than a fortnight, he treated me with the polite courtesy one might show a capable housekeeper. I managed his home. I bore his name. I existed in the margins of his life. By 47, I had made peace with my circumstances. Some women were loved, I was merely married. It was not unusual. It was simply my lot. Then my husband came home unexpectedly, accompanied by his closest friend. Lord Edmund Blackwood, Earl of Thornbury, had been a fixture in Henry's life since their university days. He visited occasionally, always charming, always attentive, asking questions about the estate and my welfare with an interest my husband never displayed. I had always found him pleasant company, a welcome interruption to my solitary existence. But when they walked into the drawing-room that November afternoon, my husband grim-faced, the Earl pale as death, I sensed that something had fundamentally changed. Henry was holding a bundle of papers. Letters. My letters. Letters addressed to him but opened, read, carefully preserved, 312 of them, bound with ribbon and organized by date. And they had been found, not in Henry's London residence where they should have been delivered, but in the Earl of Thornbury's private study. If you want to know why the Earl intercepted my letters, and what happened when my husband finally read them, subscribe right now. This channel is just beginning, and every single subscriber helps us reach 10,000. Stay with me. This story is about to reveal a betrayal that spans 2 decades. My name is Honoria Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscliffe, and I had spent 23 years believing my husband did not care enough to answer my letters. I had married Lord Henry Ashworth when he was 31 and I was 24, a match arranged by our families, combining his ancient title with my considerable fortune. I had been raised to expect such arrangements, taught that love was a pleasant surprise rather than a requirement, trained to find satisfaction in duty if happiness proved elusive. The wedding was grand, impersonal, exhausting. Henry was courteous throughout, but his eyes held no warmth. On our wedding night, he fulfilled his obligations with mechanical efficiency and left for London 3 days later. I did not see him again for 6 months. That first separation established the pattern of our marriage. Henry lived in London, attending to parliamentary business and social obligations that apparently required his constant presence. I remained at Ravenscliffe Hall in Yorkshire, managing an estate that generated the income funding his metropolitan existence. I wrote because I did not know what else to do. The letters were my attempt to build a bridge across the distance he had created. I told him about the estate because I thought he would want to know. I told him about myself because I thought he might someday care. I poured my heart onto paper because I had no one else to whom I could confide. The silence that greeted each letter was devastating at first, then puzzling, then eventually just normal. I adapted to it as one adapts to any chronic condition. I stopped expecting replies. I continued writing because the act of writing had become its own comfort, regardless of whether anyone read the words. I never imagined that someone was reading them. I never imagined it was the Earl. The confrontation in the drawing room was unlike anything I had experienced in 23 years of marriage. Henry stood by the fireplace, my letters clutched in his hands, his face a study in controlled fury that I had never seen before. The Earl sat in a chair near the window, his usual easy charm entirely absent, replaced by an expression I could only describe as haunted. "Would you care to explain," Henry said, his voice dangerously quiet, "why I found 312 letters from my wife in your study? Letters addressed to me that I never received." I looked between them, trying to understand what I was witnessing. "Edmund has been intercepting your correspondence," Henry continued. "For the entirety of our marriage. Every letter you sent me, he took. Every letter I might have written to you, he ensured I had no reason to compose." "That is not entirely accurate," the Earl began. "Quiet." Henry's voice cracked like a whip. "You will have your opportunity to explain. First, I want my wife to understand what has been done to her." He crossed the room and placed the bundle of letters in my hands. They were warm from being held, heavy with 2 decades of words I had thought disappeared into void. "I found these yesterday," Henry said, his voice slightly softer now that he was speaking to me. "I was at Edmund's estate for a hunting party. I went into his study looking for writing paper and found a shrine." "A shrine?" "A locked drawer containing every letter you ever wrote. Organized by date. Some with annotations in his handwriting." Henry's jaw tightened. "He has been reading your private correspondence for 23 years. Responding to it in his own journal. Building a relationship with you that you never knew existed." I stared at the Earl, this man I had always considered pleasant, harmless, my husband's friend rather than mine. "Why?" The question emerged before I could stop it, carrying 23 years of confusion and pain. "Because I loved you." The Earl's voice was barely audible. "From the moment I met you at your wedding. I loved you, and I could not bear to watch Henry ignore you when I would have given anything for your attention." The silence that followed was absolute. This is where the truth emerges. If you are feeling the weight of this revelation, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Subscribe. Like this video. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers. The Earl's confession hung in the air like poison. I sat down slowly, the letters heavy in my lap, trying to process what I was hearing. This man, this friend of my husband's, this occasional visitor who had always seemed so kind, had been intercepting my private correspondence for over 2 decades. "You had no right," I said finally. "Those letters were not meant for you." "I know." Edmund's voice was hoarse with emotion. "I know I had no right. But Honoria, your grace, you have to understand. Henry never appreciated you. He left you alone in this vast house, never visited, never wrote, never showed the slightest interest in your existence. And I came to know you through those letters. Your intelligence, your humor, your loneliness that mirrored my own. You knew I was lonely because you were causing my loneliness. I felt anger building, unfamiliar and intoxicating. If Henry had received my letters, he might have replied. We might have built a connection. He would not have replied." Edmund's certainty stopped me cold. "I know Henry. I have known him for 40 years. He married you for your fortune and expected nothing else. Your letters would have irritated him at best, embarrassed him at worst. I spared you the rejection. You spared yourself the competition." Henry spoke from his position by the fireplace. "You did not want her to reach me because you wanted her for yourself. I never touched her. I never approached her improperly. You violated her privacy for 23 years. You sabotaged her marriage. You maintained a secret relationship with her correspondence while pretending to be a family friend." Henry's voice rose. "You are the worst kind of traitor, Edmund. You betrayed me while dining at my table. You never valued what you had." Edmund stood, his composure cracking. "You left a remarkable woman alone in the countryside while you pursued every distraction London had to offer. You ignored her letters because you assumed she had nothing worth saying. I read them because I knew she did. You do not get to claim moral superiority. I am claiming nothing. I am explaining. I loved her, Henry. I still love her. And I will not apologize for recognizing what you were too blind to see. The argument continued for another hour, accusations flying between two men who had apparently been rivals for decades without my knowledge. I sat silent through most of it, reading fragments of my own letters, remembering the circumstances that had prompted each one. The letter about the flooding in the lower fields, written during a crisis that had required immediate decisions I had made alone because no response ever came. The letter about my illness 2 winters past. I had been genuinely frightened, genuinely in need of comfort, and I had received nothing. Except, apparently, someone had read those words. Someone had cared, even if that caring had been built on theft. The realization was profoundly disorienting. Enough, I said finally, interrupting yet another exchange of recriminations. Both men fell silent, turning to look at me as though they had forgotten I was present. Your Grace, Edmund began. Do not call me that. I stood, clutching the letters to my chest. I need time to understand what has happened. Both of you, leave me. This is my house, Henry protested. It is the house I have managed for 23 years while you lived elsewhere. For tonight, I am claiming it as my own. I moved toward the door. The Earl can stay in the guest wing. You may have your chambers. But I require solitude to process what I have learned. Neither man argued. I spent the night in my sitting room, reading through 23 years of my own correspondence, seeing my life through the lens of words I had almost forgotten writing. The early letters were heartbreaking, so hopeful, so eager to please, so certain that affection would develop if only I tried hard enough. The middle years showed resignation setting in, the tone becoming more businesslike, the personal revelations fewer. The recent letters were almost clinical, reports rather than conversations, a wife communicating with a stranger who shared her name. I had watched myself give up, letter by letter, year by year. And somewhere in London, a man I barely knew had watched me give up too. Morning brought no clarity, only exhaustion and the necessity of decisions I was not prepared to make. I found both men in the breakfast room, sitting at opposite ends of the table in pointed silence. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unfinished accusations. I have questions, I said, taking my seat at the center of the table, a position I had never claimed before. You will both answer them honestly. Henry nodded stiffly. Edmund looked at me with desperate hope that I found unsettling. Edmund, how did you intercept the letters? Henry's correspondence was managed by his secretary, a man named Pemberton. I cultivated his loyalty over the years. He believed he was helping prevent unnecessary domestic disturbances by forwarding personal correspondence to me for review. He was bribed. He was persuaded that his employer's peace of mind was better served by screening certain communications. The letters from you were flagged as potentially troublesome. And Henry's replies? The replies I never received. There were no replies. Edmund's voice was flat. I told you the truth about that. Henry never attempted to write to you. Pemberton confirmed this regularly. I turned to my husband. Is this true? Henry had the grace to look uncomfortable. I am not a man given to correspondence. I assumed you were managing adequately. If there had been genuine emergencies, Pemberton would have informed me. Genuine emergencies. I laughed, though there was no humor in it. I wrote to you when the roof collapsed in the East Wing. I wrote when the tenant riots threatened the harvest. I wrote when I was so ill the physician told me to prepare my affairs. I received none of those letters. Because your friend intercepted them and your secretary chose not to inform you. But even if they had arrived, would you have responded? Would you have come home? The silence answered my question. No, Henry admitted finally. Probably not. Then perhaps Edmund was right about one thing. Perhaps I was spared rejection I could not have borne. We are at the reckoning now. If you are feeling the weight of these accumulated betrayals, share this video with someone who has ever felt unheard. Subscribe. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Every single one of you matters. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. Henry, confronted with evidence of his neglect, seemed genuinely shaken. He read through my letters one by one, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something that might have been remorse. You wrote about poetry, he said one evening, finding me in the library. I did not know you cared for poetry. You did not know anything about me. You never asked. No, I did not. He sat across from me, looking older than his 54 years. I married you for your money, Honoria. I was honest about that, at least with myself. But I assumed the arrangement was sufficient for both of us. It was sufficient for you. You had your London life, your clubs, your distractions. I had an empty house and letters that disappeared into silence. I should have done better. Yes. You should have. I set down my book. But Edmund should not have done what he did either. Whatever my marriage lacked, it was mine to navigate. He had no right to insert himself into my private thoughts. He claims he loved you. He claims he loved a fiction. He loved the woman in the letters, honest, perhaps, but incomplete. He never knew me. He knew only what I chose to reveal to a husband I was trying to reach. And what will you do now? Now that you know the truth? I considered the question carefully. I will decide whether this marriage is worth salvaging, or whether too much damage has been done. Edmund remained at Ravenscliffe Hall for a week, confined to the guest wing, awaiting some form of judgment that neither Henry nor I was prepared to deliver. I visited him once, seeking answers to questions that had accumulated over days of reflection. Did you respond to me? In your journal? He looked up from the window where he had been staring at the grey Yorkshire sky. Yes. I wrote replies to every letter. I told you about my days, my thoughts, my reactions to what you had shared. He smiled bitterly. I had a correspondence with you that lasted 23 years. You simply did not know about it. That is not a correspondence. That is an obsession. Perhaps. But it was also the most genuine relationship I have ever had. He turned to face me fully. I never married, Honoria. I could not bear to marry someone who was not you. I watched you through your letters, watched you grow and change and adapt to loneliness, and I fell more deeply in love with each passing year. You fell in love with a ghost. The letters were addressed to Henry. The woman writing them was trying to reach her husband, not entertain a secret admirer. I know it was wrong. I know I have no defense that absolves me of what I did. His voice cracked. But I cannot regret knowing you, even through stolen words. You were the most important person in my life, even if I was nothing in yours. You were not nothing. You were a pleasant visitor, a friend of my husband's, someone who brightened the occasional afternoon. I sat in the chair across from him. But you were not what you imagined yourself to be. You were not my secret confidant or my hidden love. You were a stranger reading private letters, constructing a relationship that existed only in your mind. I know. Then why did you continue? For 23 years, why did you not simply stop? Because stopping meant losing you. And I could not bear that loss. His eyes met mine, filled with the desperate sincerity of a man who had finally been exposed. I would rather have had a fragment of you than nothing at all. I asked Edmund to leave. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. His presence complicated my ability to think clearly about the wreckage of my marriage and what, if anything, could be salvaged from it. He went quietly, pressing a journal into my hands before he departed. 23 years of replies, he said. You deserve to know what I thought, even if you never wanted to hear it. I did not read the journal immediately. I was not ready to encounter his version of our non-existent relationship, to see myself reflected through eyes I had never known were watching. Instead, I focused on Henry. To his credit, my husband seemed genuinely committed to understanding what he had neglected. He read through my letters methodically, asking questions about events I had described, people I had mentioned, emotions I had revealed. He was, belatedly, trying to know the wife he had ignored for 2 decades. Why did you keep writing? He asked one evening. If I never replied, why did you continue? Because I had no one else to talk to. The letters were as much for me as for you, a way of processing my thoughts, maintaining connection to a world beyond these walls. I paused. And because I kept hoping, against all evidence, I kept hoping that someday you would answer. That is remarkably persistent. It is remarkably foolish. I know that now. I looked at him. This stranger I had been married to for 23 years. But it is also who I am. I do not give up easily, even when I should. Will you give up on this marriage? I do not know. What would you have me save? We have no children, no shared history beyond legal bonds. You have your London life, I have this estate. What is there to preserve? The possibility of something better. Henry moved closer, his expression more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. I am 54 years old. I have spent 30 years pursuing empty pleasures that have left me with nothing of substance. Edmund's betrayal forced me to see what I had neglected: a wife who deserved attention, a life that could have been meaningful, connections I dismissed because I was too lazy to maintain them. Pretty words. Can you live them? I want to try. If you will let me. I read Edmund's journal on a cold December night, alone in my sitting room, a fire crackling against the Yorkshire chill. His entries were dated to match my letters, creating a parallel record of years that had passed very differently for each of us. Where my letters spoke of loneliness and duty, his responses spoke of longing and admiration. Where I described the estate's operations, he reflected on my competence and dedication. Where I revealed my struggles with isolation, he ached to provide the companionship I so clearly craved. It was, as I had suspected, a love story. But one in which I was a character rather than a participant. The final entries, written just before his exposure, were the most revealing. She wrote today about the November rains. One read. The way she describes the changing seasons is poetry itself, though she would never claim it. I have watched her grow from a hopeful young bride into a woman of remarkable resilience, all through these stolen glimpses into her heart. I know I have no right to these insights. I know what I am doing is a violation of her trust, even though she does not know that trust exists. But I cannot stop. She has become the center of my existence, and I do not know how to live without her words. The next entry, written the day before Henry found the letters. I am growing old. 62 years, and what have I accomplished? I have loved a woman from afar, known her more intimately than her own husband, and never once told her the truth. When I die, these journals will be found, and she will know what I was. Will she hate me? Probably. But perhaps she will also understand that she was loved, truly loved, even if that love took a form she would never have chosen. I closed the journal and wept. Not for Edmund, I could not forgive what he had done, however tragic his motivations. But for myself. For the girl who had written letters to silence, hoping for connection. For the woman who had adapted to loneliness because she saw no alternative. For the life I might have had if anyone had simply been honest. The resolution came slowly, over months of conversation and negotiation that felt more like diplomatic treaties than marital reconciliation. Henry made genuine efforts. He stayed at Ravenscliffe Hall through the winter, engaging with the estate he had ignored, learning the names of tenants he had never met. He read, discussed, debated. Treating me as a person whose thoughts mattered rather than a housekeeper whose reports could be filed and forgotten. It was not love. After 23 years, I was not certain love was possible between us. But it was something. I should have read your letters, he admitted, near the end of that long winter. Not because Edmund was reading them, that discovery merely revealed what I had neglected. But because you were my wife, and you deserved acknowledgement. Yes, I did. I cannot undo what happened. I cannot restore the years I wasted. But I can try to make the remaining years different. Different is not the same as better. No. But it is a start. He took my hand, a gesture so unusual that I nearly pulled away. I am asking for a chance to be the husband I should have been. I know I do not deserve that chance. I am asking anyway. I considered his request, weighing it against 23 years of silence. 1 year, I said finally. Give me 1 year of genuine effort, and I will decide whether this marriage can become something worth preserving. 1 year. If you fail, if you retreat to London, if the letters go unanswered, if you prove that this remorse is merely temporary, I will seek a formal separation. I will not spend another decade hoping for attention you cannot provide. That is fair. It is more than fair. It is generous, considering what I have endured. We began again. Not from the beginning. That was impossible. But from where we were, with clear eyes and modest expectations and the knowledge that truth, however painful, was better than the lies we had both been living. Henry kept his promise. He stayed at Ravenscliffe Hall not just for 1 year but for the remainder of his life. He answered my letters when he had to travel, Actual replies that arrived within days rather than disappearing into silence. He learned to know me, the woman I had become through decades of adaptation. And I learned to know him. We never achieved the passionate connection that romantic stories celebrate. We were too old, too damaged, too shaped by our separate histories. But we achieved partnership, companionship, a quiet understanding that grew deeper as the years passed. Henry died at 71, peacefully, with me beside him. "I am sorry," he said, near the end. "For all the years I wasted. For all the letters I never read. You read them eventually. That has to count for something. Does it? It counts for everything. You tried, Henry. In the end, you tried." Edmund died 3 years before Henry, alone on his estate, leaving his journals to me in his will. I burned them without reading them again. Whatever relationship he had imagined between us existed only in his mind, and I had no interest in preserving it. I lived another 12 years as the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscliffe, finally receiving the attention from society that my position warranted. I wrote no more letters, I had no one left to write to, but I kept the 312 I had composed over 23 years of marriage. They were evidence of my persistence. My hope. My refusal to accept that silence was the only answer. The Duchess had written him 312 letters. He had never replied. But in the end, he had read them. He had understood what they revealed about the woman he had married and ignored. And he had spent his final years trying to become worthy of her. That was not the love story I had imagined when I wrote that first letter, 3 days after my wedding. But it was the love story I eventually received. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If it moved you, if it reminded you that the truth eventually emerges and that it is never too late to try, please subscribe. This channel is just beginning, and every single subscriber helps us reach 10,000. Share this video with someone who has ever written letters that went unanswered. Comment where you are watching from, I read every single one, and I want to say hello to you. Like this video. Subscribe to our channel. Help us reach the people who need these stories. Until next time, remember, keep writing, keep hoping, keep reaching out. Someday, someone will finally read your words and understand.